Getting fit, keep walking up and down the stairs. Well, there's only 3 of them, but... Right, morning everybody. Really nice to see you all. This morning we're in Nehemiah chapter 5. We're going to be thinking about unity, church unity, the unity of us. How are we united? How are sometimes we disunited? Unfortunately, that's a reality, isn't it? We can become disunited. And to give an example of what's perhaps going on in this chapter, it's a football illustration again, sorry, you get used to me making football illustrations, but not last season, but the season before, it was a massive surprise to all football fans that Leicester City won the Premier League title. They weren't expected to win it, they were expected to be fighting off relegation from the Premier League, and they won. But then last season, as defending champions, they went from winning to fighting against being relegated. And if you like, they went from champs to chumps, yeah? They went from champs to chumps. It couldn't be more different, the 2 seasons. And in this chapter in Nehemiah 5, in a similar way, it's kind of happening. Because in chapter 2 and verse 18, it says, well, let us start rebuilding. Yes, they began this good work. In other versions, it says, their hands were strengthened and they were ready to do the work. They were all up for it. They united. Let's rebuild the walls. And then by chapter 5, we read, now the men and their wives raised a great outcry. An outcry amongst their own people. Because things couldn't be more different, could it? 1 minute they're ready, they're strengthened, everyone's going for it, they want to rebuild, and the next minute they're complaining about each other. And you know, church unity, or just unity in general, is not something that just happens, is it? You're not just united, are you? We're always united by something. Even in disunity, one group can be united by an opinion, and another group is united. It's always something or someone that brings unity, isn't it? So what is it that currently unites us at HBC? What is it? And that's what we need to look at today. As a little bit of context, in chapter 4, we can read that Judah, these people, they had come under attack from outsiders because people outside were kind of getting a bit jealous and worried the fact that they were rebuilding the walls. They already rebuilt the temple, think, hang on, these are going to become a powerful nation, so we need to kind of stop them in their tracks. So the threats were so bad that as people were building, they actually were carrying weapons on them. And as people were building, they had people guarding the people who were building. So the threats were quite serious. So these were quite vulnerable people. These were people whose resources were stretched, and they needed everybody's support and everybody's help. But the sad thing was, the greatest opposition to this work was not coming from those violent physical threats outside. The greatest opposition to this work was about to come from within. And it was an inside job, if you like. That's why my sermon title this morning is an inside job. And that's really sad, isn't it? But that's the greatest threat that was about to hit these people who were 1 minute were united in this work, and the next minute they're about to fall apart. And I think for us, so often, the greatest threat, isn't it, to the work of the church, the work of the gospel, is unity, is trouble from within, isn't it? Sadly, that's been an experience of mine occasionally, and I'm sure it might have been your experience. But the greatest threat comes from within. And so I think it'd be really good for us this morning to kind of observe and to let God teach us and take notice of this story, what's happening, so we can learn some valuable lessons, not just as a church, but to take into our family life, into our marriage, into our friendships. So, let's crack on then. Why and how was there disunity? Well, before we get into it, I want you to really step into this morning, the story, and just feel the pain and the oppression, the pain and the desperation. If we read verses 1 to 5, you'll see that in verse 1, it says there was a great outcry, and that kind of shows the intensity, doesn't it? That shows the intensity of the oppression of the problems. There was a great outcry, not just one person crying out, but there was loads of people, loads of families saying, we are not happy. We are desperate. In verse 1, there's complaints about each other. In verse 2, there's families that are struggling to even eat, to even exist. There are people having to remortgage their assets just to get by. There are people taking out loans against what they own so they can pay the taxes. And worst of all, there are their own fellow people who are richer, in a better off position, who are making demands and exploiting these poorer people by saying, I'll tell you what, I'll pay for your bit of land you've got, but they don't pay the full price, they pay a knockdown price. And actually I could do with a few slaves, so, sell me some of your sons and your daughters. So it's an awful situation, isn't it? So basically you could say they'd been enslaved by their own people. Enslaved by their own people. And that's a complete contradiction to the grace of God, isn't it? In verse 8 of chapter 5, Nehemiah speaking, he says these words. He says, we, as far as we are able, have brought back our Jewish brothers who have been sold to the nations. They've brought them back out of exile. But even you sell your brothers that they may be sold to us. So they've been freed from exile and now they're enslaved again. It's like they've been freed for slavery. And that is ironic, isn't it? That they spent, I think it's 60 years in exile, and then Nehemiah kind of does a deal and some people are allowed back in stages, and they get to rebuild their own temple, they get to start rebuilding their own walls, have their own land, their own place again, and yet their own people are enslaving them. And that is wrong, isn't it? That is wrong. God's people are free people, aren't they? We should be the freest people on this planet Earth, shouldn't we? We live in so much freedom. Galatians 5:1 says, it's for freedom that Christ has set us free. These people certainly hadn't been set free for freedom, had they? And I think right now we kind of need to say this is one of the first mistakes. This is one of the first mistakes on the road to disunity. Because basically we can lose sight of the real mission. Sometimes at home, those of you who don't know us, we've got a big family. I think you all know that now. We've got a super-sized family, okay? And sometimes me and Jane, we've got an important decision to make, and we just need a little bit of quiet to talk, okay? It just never happens. And we say, I'll tell you what, we'll put a DVD on, okay? You all sit in the lounge, and I make an agreement with them. You're going to sit. They're listening to this. Yeah. Okay. You just sit. You'll be quiet, and all you're going to do is watch the DVD. Yeah. Yep. That's all we're going to do, Dad. No one's going to move from their chair, are they? No. No one's going to talk to anyone else. You're just going to watch and enjoy the film together. Yeah. Because me and Mum have got something really important to do, something important to talk about, and there is agreement. So we walk out, shut the door, we sit down, and then within 5 minutes we have something that can resemble this. Yeah, it's Reuben and Rafi a few years ago. Yeah, within 5 minutes, people have left their chairs. There's a fight going on. It might just be a play fight. Somebody doesn't want to watch that DVD anymore. Yeah, it's just all gone pear-shaped. And what's happened? They made an agreement with me, but they lost sight of the mission of the agreement, haven't they? And then there's anarchy. And that's what's happening here. They had an agreement. They were all rebuilding the walls. They all had to do it together. It couldn't be done by a few people. They all had to support each other. And as things got harder, they lost sight of the mission. They started to follow their own ideas of how to solve the problem. They started to follow their own wisdom. And when things get difficult in church, when resources are stretched, when people are tired, when we lose sight of the mission, why we're all here, we're all sinners saved by grace, then problems come. We start following our own wisdom. And actually, we can start to enslave each other by our own pursuits of what we think is right, by our own ambition. We can enslave each other with our words, our actions, our criticisms, our habits, our pride, our refusal to change, our backbiting, even sometimes our anxiety about the future, about a situation. That's an anti-family of God, Spirit of God, Christ-centred Spirit of God attitude, isn't it? Let's read 1 Thessalonians 5. It says, "Therefore, encourage one another and build each other up." That is not what is happening here, is it? That is, what is happening here is anti the Apostle Paul's words and what we should be doing for each other. And that is what happens when we lose sight of the mission, of the reason why we're in church in the very first place, the reason why we're serving Jesus. And in this story, people were prospering themselves while their own kind were going hungry and facing financial ruin. James 3:16, really interesting verse, says, "For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice." Yeah, this attitude brings disorder, disunity. The previous verses that say, "But if you harbour bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic." So sometimes we can kind of on the outside be saying, I want to look good in church, but I'm harbouring bitterness and problems and criticism. I'm backbiting. I've got an ambition to see this happen in church, and it's going to happen at whatever cost. But on the front, the outside, I love my church. I just want the best for it. Come on, we need to pray for our leadership. James says, do you know what another version? James says, you're being false to the truth. Because it's not Jesus, is it? The way we talk, think, pray, and serve each other should be a response to the way God has treated us, shouldn't it? So that's what's happening. That's why they're disunited. In a very general, quick way, that's why we can be disunited. But let's look at Nehemiah. Let's look at Nehemiah, what he does. Nehemiah is the benevolent hero, I've called him. He is an amazing guy, an amazing man, what he does. We need to look at what he does. We need to look at how he responds. We need to look at how he restores unity. Because he does restore unity. And this is a really desperate situation. This is Ephesians 4, verse 3 in practice. Let's look at that verse. This is a really often quoted verse when we're talking about unity in church. It says, not that one, we go back one. I haven't put it on, so I'll look it up. Sorry, Luke. Do you know what? Luke never gets it wrong, but I always do. Right, Ephesians 4. It is there. Thank you, guys. Thanks for your support. Make every effort, that's it. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. That's a really well-worn verse. It's a great verse. When things go wrong in church, you kind of hear this verse quoted. Well, that's a good verse to quote, but this is what Ephesians 4:3 looks like. What Nehemiah is about to do is Ephesians 4:3 lived out. And actually, this is God's gift to us, what Nehemiah does. Via courtesy of Nehemiah, this is God's gift to us as a church on how we should behave. And as we go through the things that Nehemiah does, just take a look at each one, because one of them will be your weakness and my weakness. And maybe one or two of them might be your strength. And then we can look at them and go, right, do you know what? I'm going to pray I improve in that area, because I can spot that in myself as a weakness. And you might see a strength and go, actually, I need to do more, because that's a strength of that. And it's not just something, as I said earlier, we can take as a church. It's something that we can build into our family as well, and into our marriages. So what does he do? The first thing he does is he listens. Verse 1 It says, now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. This is a cry for help, isn't it? I think it's important to say that the cry for help is not always obvious, is it? The cry for help is not always made in words that say, help me. The cry for help comes in many different forms, and it's quite often displayed in emotional behaviour or sometimes bad decisions, uncharacteristic behaviour. But it's really important that Nehemiah listened, because he could never have helped them in the first place if he wasn't listening to their complaints, to their problems, to their needs. And I think what's even more striking is think how busy Nehemiah was. He is the governor. He's in charge. He is responsible for this rebuilding work. He's got people attacking from outside. But the people come first. He stops and he listens. And so that's a really important point, first of all, isn't it? Let's listen. Let's listen to each other. Doesn't mean we're going to agree with each other, does it? But let's listen. Let's have our ears open and our hearts open. The second thing was he was angry. Verse 6. Yeah. It says, I was very angry when I heard their outcry and these words. This is a bit strange, isn't it? I'm saying, let's talk about unity, and my second point was be angry. That sounds like a contradiction, doesn't it? But Nehemiah was angry because he was passionate about the things that really matter. He was passionate about people and what was happening in their lives. And it's okay to be angry about that if that is driven by compassion. In Psalm 4, verse 4, it says, be angry and do not sin. That's a really hard sort of line to tread, that, isn't it? Because one little step either way and it's going to go wrong. But you could say this, can you love someone truly and never be angry? You can't, can you? You can't. About 5 or 6 years ago, our eldest boy, George, I used to pick him up from school in the afternoons. Same time, same place every day. And then one day, I think I was a minute late, and he was gone. He's gone. He was not in sight anywhere. And we spent about 2 hours trying to find him. And eventually he just turned up home. Oh, I walked home because you were late. I was 1 minute late. But I went through so much worry. I was phoning everybody. I started driving around. And get past the hour stage. I mean, he's about 15, so he's a bit older. But you then start to worry a little bit more, don't you? And when I saw him, I was so pleased to see him. But actually, I was angry with him. I said, we were so worried about you. Don't do that again. I was angry because I cared. And he had to see that anger a little bit, didn't he? To know that I cared and to know that actually our actions can cause a bit of problem and hurt. But the driving force behind being angry was the passion and the caring, wasn't it? But the balance to that is Nehemiah's other reaction, which was he was wise and he was not flippant. It says in verse 7, he said, I pondered them in my mind. Actually, in the ESV version, it says, I took counsel with myself. You see, this is the balance to Psalm 4, which I read, wasn't it? About be angry and do not sin. If you carry on there, it says, ponder in your own hearts, on your beds and be silent. You see, be passionate. Yeah, maybe get angry about something in a passionate, caring way, but don't be flippant. Nehemiah, he sees this problem, he listens, he cares, he's angry, he wants a resolution, a solution to this. But then he stops and goes, right, what's the best way? What's the best way? What does God want me to do? What's the best decision for these people? Not just for the people who are being wronged, but for the people who are doing the wrongdoing. We need to make a decision about them as well. Another family home illustration for you is one day, this is like a really bad story because Tilly was on the table. Don't know what she's on the table for, but Then it gets worse because she was hitting Tabitha. Okay. No one calls social services, please. Right. All right. And she was hitting Tabitha, and she was hurting Tabitha. So I just patted her on the bum, like, stop, patted her. And that was it. She went like this. And she nearly fell off the table, and I had to catch her. Told you the story is really bad and gets worse. But I had to catch her. And I think that illustrates this point, because you could say, right, Paul, yes, that was wise to deal with that problem that Tabitha was being hurt by Tilly, but you were flippant the way you did it because it nearly hurt Tilly. Yeah? I was wise, but I was flippant. Wise to punish, flippant to not stop and think, to not stop and ponder about what was happening. And that's what Nehemiah does. You know, because in a family, the decision is never about you, is it? It's about how it affects us all, isn't it? And we're a family. We're God's family, aren't we? Decision in a family, it's never just about the individual. So we need to be wise and not flippant. And sometimes when we're the opposite of that, our timing's a little off, isn't it? What else did Nehemiah do? Well, he believed in accountability. He believed in accountability. Verse 7, he says, so I called together a large meeting to deal with them, to deal with the people who were buying slaves off these poorer families, buying their land at a cheap price. And what I think is important here is he made not just them accountable, but he made himself accountable, didn't he? By dealing with it in a public way. He made his actions accountable so everyone could see what he was doing. But he made them accountable by saying, look, no, we're not having this. I'm exposing this wrongdoing. It's wrong. You need to know it's wrong. Everyone needs to know it's wrong. Accountability is a real good thing, but it's a really difficult thing, isn't it, in church? But actually, to be Christ-like and to keep growing in a Christ-like way, we need to have accountability, don't we? And that's all part of being united, being accountable. And, you know, as a side point to that, I'll just say, if anyone needs to hear this, it's okay to stop pretending that you're an amazing Christian. Because it's okay to say you're struggling. It's okay to say, I've made a mistake. Because that's family, isn't it? We're so worried sometimes, aren't we, about how we look and how we appear. Sometimes none more so in church than even more out in the world. That's the wrong way around, isn't it? Accountability. Nehemiah held wrongdoing to account. And no, it's not a religious accountability. It's not, listen, I haven't seen you for the past 4 Sundays. What on earth is going on? I'm thinking about removing you from membership. No, it's you're hungry. You're starving. You're losing stuff. You're finding day-to-day life a massive struggle. I want to help these people. And to the other people, he holds them accountable, and it's like, this is not happening anymore. We don't live like this. This is not how this family lives. We don't do this to each other. He's not a bystander, just wagging his fingers. He's saying, that's bad. Okay, verse 8. He was humble and he was not hypocritical. He was humble and is not hypocritical. I'm going to read verse 8. I'm reading out the ESV, so it might read a little differently. I've read this already, but I think this is important to read it again. It says, and he said to them, we, as far as we are able, have brought back our Jewish brothers who have been sold to the nations, but you even sell your brothers that they may be sold to us. You see, this is a really simple point. He treated people in the spirit of the gospel, didn't he? That's all he did. He was like, we've been freed. We can't treat people like they're slaves. And that's church, isn't it? We're a free people. We're a free people. And sometimes we can make a big play on a particular sin. And it's like we've never sinned, isn't it? We can really bring someone down. We can really knock them down. And we go about the whole accountability thing in the wrong way. We need to be humble and say, do you know what? I'm a sinner as well. You're struggling. This is the solution. He doesn't even say to them, do you realise how much I'm doing for you? How much I'm sacrificing for you? I'm not doing that anymore. He doesn't go the martyr route either. He just shows grace. And what does grace do? It produces grace, doesn't it? Verses 14 to 18, Nehemiah shows us to have unity, to maintain unity. He was generous, kind, and servant-hearted in a massive, massive way. I can remember a few Christmases ago, I was playing a game of Monopoly, a late-night game of Monopoly with some friends, and a little while into the game, after I'm not very good at Monopoly, but I'd accumulated a couple of properties and the odd hotel, and I kind of looked around and I thought, I don't like the way this game's heading. The game is to get as much as you can, isn't it? And to get everyone's money. And I kind of see it bringing out all the bad stuff in people, like roll a 5, then you're going to land on my hotel, Yeah, it's like, and I was looking around thinking, yeah, I don't like this. So I thought, I'm going to change tactic. I'm going to be generous. So if someone was struggling, like, here, I'm going to lend you some money. And they landed on my hotel, be like, you can't afford it? That's all right. Okay. I was not the first one out of the game. I won the game. I won the game because when it got really desperate and it got to the last sort of 2 or 3 people and they were just fighting it out, in the end they're like, no, right, I don't want to give my hotel that I've got to give up to you. I'm giving it to Paul because he was generous. I ended up with I was very rich. And that kind of made me think about Nehemiah. He actually had so much luxury and privilege as a governor from King Artaxerxes. He had all the food that he wanted. And he talks about the people who ruled before him, who just used to live in this luxury while maybe some people were struggling. You could have kind of forgiven him for indulging himself a little, considering under the hardships he was under as leading this people, the job he had to do, the oppression. But actually, he just shares the lot. He shares the lot. He was generous, he was kind, he was servant-hearted. It's like he said, it's not mine, it's God's. So I'm just going to share it. You're struggling, I feel like I'm struggling. I'm going to share. I'm going to be generous. I'm going to be kind. He had this, I think I mentioned this back in July, this illustration that was mentioned a few years before in the church. It was the elder brother or father illustration, which you may have heard before, which is you can have sometimes 2 types of people in church. You can have the elder brother who is, you didn't have it as hard as what I had it, yeah? Why'd you not tell him off, Mum and Dad, like you told me off? I used to have to go to bed an hour earlier than that. He should, yeah? That's the elder brother attitude. The father attitude is, I don't want you to struggle like I did. When we were younger, we had to go through this. There's no way you're doing that, yeah? And quite often in church, there's 2 types of people, isn't there? There's the elder brother that says, you're going to have it as hard as what I had it, because that will do you good. Or there's the father attitude that says, I don't want you to suffer. And if you do suffer, I'm going to suffer with you. I'm try and make the burden lighter. That's what Nehemiah does. And then, really importantly, in verse 13, we see that he was committed to God. It does something really strange. It looks strange to us. It says, I also shook out the fold of my garment. and said, "So may God shake out every man from his house and from his labour who does not keep the promise. So may he be shaken out and emptied out." I mean, can you imagine if Greg or Chris were leading a church meeting, there had been some problems, and then he just took off his shirt and went, "That's it, I've had enough." You'd be thinking, there's the exit door. Taxi for Greg, taxi for Chris. But actually, that's cultural what's happening there. It's a cultural thing, and it's very symbolic. To get the garment, to shake it. To shake it. Because he's basically saying, no more. We're shaking off this attitude. We're shaking off this problem. This is not going to exist in Jerusalem amongst these people. No way, it stops here. And he's basically drawing a line in the sand and saying, no more. So maybe for us as a church, maybe for you as an individual, there's something where you actually just need to draw a line in the sand. In certain areas of your life, maybe where you've been struggling, maybe where you've not been so committed to the purposes of God. You just need to draw a line in the sand and say, no more. Enough. Or maybe you're observing a situation and you are a very concerned bystander, but you need to say, actually, we need to draw a line in the sand here because this can't happen in God's family. We're going to say no more because we are committed to the spirit of unity found in Jesus, and we're drawing a line in the sand. A drawing the line in the sand verse is Joshua 24:15, which is not on the PowerPoint, so don't worry. Or is it? No, it isn't. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That's a drawing the line in the sand verse, isn't it? And then the last thing that Nehemiah does, which is such a great picture, verse 10 to 12, he didn't call in debts. He wrote them off. He didn't call in debts, he wrote them off. Verses 10 to 12 says, Moreover, I and my brothers and my servants are lending them money and grain. Let us abandon this exacting of interest. Return to them this very day their fields, their vineyards, their olive orchards and their houses, and the percentage of money, grain, wine and oil that you have been exacting from them. Then they said, we will restore these and require nothing from them. We will do as you say. And he calls the priest and he makes them swear and promise not to do any more. Nehemiah says, let's start as we mean to go on. Let's start as we mean to go on. He really leads in the spirit of the gospel, doesn't he? He writes off debts. And again, as I've just said about drawing a line in the sand, is it fair to say maybe that there's a few emotional debts maybe amongst us this morning? There are things that we might be holding against our brothers and sisters in Christ. There are people who have wronged us, who have hurt us, and we are waiting to call in that debt. We are waiting to be satisfied for the hurt that has been caused to us, for the pain that we have felt. If we are, that is not a pathway to unity, is it? Nehemiah writes off these debts. He relieves their oppression. What does 2 Corinthians 5 verse 21 say? God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Jesus paid my debt of sin that I could not pay. Jesus has paid your debt of sin that you could never pay off. He's done it freely, and he's done it because he loves you. How are we going to respond to that? That's the real key message, isn't it, of church unity? How are we going to respond to that? So Nehemiah is an example to us this morning of crushing oppression and restoring unity. He listens. He's angered at injustice. He's wise and he planned. He makes himself accountable and he holds others to account. He's humble and not hypocritical. He's generous, kind, and servant-hearted. He is committed to the will of God. He wrote off debts in order that people might live in more of a spirit of freedom. What was the fruit of Nehemiah's labours, efforts, and commitment? Verse 13, or the last half of verse 13, says, "And all the assembly said, Amen, and praised the Lord. And the people did as they had promised." Great job, Nehemiah, yeah? These people, they went from pain to praise. What a turnaround. What a turnaround. If we were to take these steps like Nehemiah did, then wouldn't we see our church sustained and transformed? If we were to take these steps in our family, in our marriages, in our relationships, wouldn't we see them transformed? So what is the conclusion from this? I think it's this. Nehemiah lives a life that reflects the character of God, doesn't he? He deals with this situation in a way that reflects the spirit of the gospel, the character of God. But you cannot reflect something you are not experiencing, can you? And that's why this morning we mustn't try to be like a man who lived 2,500 years ago. We mustn't walk away downhearted thinking, I just can't be like that guy. Because what we need to do is we need to realise who and what was influencing Nehemiah. Read verse 19. It says, this is Nehemiah praying. It says, "Remember for my good, O my God, all that I have done for this people." Nehemiah is not saying this. He is not holding up everything he's done as like a trophy before God and saying, look God, look what I've done. Bless what I've done. Look at everything I've done for these people. It's not a trophy of his works and efforts that he holds up. He's actually saying, no, human judgment and will are not enough. He realises he needs God. And really simply, we need Jesus, don't we? We need Jesus. We need Jesus more and more. He is the ultimate unity restorer, isn't he? He is, if you like, the trophy that we hold aloft to each other. And perhaps this can be our mantra. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer or the author and perfecter of our faith. May God bless you. Amen.